Welcome back to English 101, Rhetoric 1. This is week 11, and this is our um, lecture for rhetoric and writing. I'm going to talk about two things today, methods of persuasion, and then just a little bit on punctuation. Semicolons and colons are often confused, and I'm going to try to keep it brief. I know there's kind of a lot to cover, but I'm going to try to keep this one as brief as I can, so I'll get going with that in mind. So methods of persuasion, we've talked about this before, but I just wanted to review it and just show you how it might look in an actual paragraph. So as we talked about before, obviously to persuade is to convince someone that a particular opinion or point of view is the correct one. If you argue with a friend, if you're trying to persuade someone that your opinion is the right one about anything, whether it's the new Batman movie is a great movie or not, or I want to go to this restaurant, or I want to eat this kind of pizza, or whatever, you're using persuasion, right? Obviously, commercials, advertisements, and other things like that that we see on television or billboards or on the internet are usually persuading us to buy a product or do something. You'll often have to persuade in writing in college and in other places too. At work, you may have to persuade with memos and business letters and all kinds of different things, emails and text and fax. Well, fax is not so much a thing these days, but all these business kinds of communications are things that we often use persuasion. And so obviously knowing how to persuade logically and rationally, you're going to also be less likely, you'll not only be better at persuading people, but you'll be less likely to accept information that's false, misleading, or just overly emotional arguments that you hear and read every day. And believe me, I think we're living in a time where there's a lot of information and that's out there that's hard to sort through sometimes. So again, this to me is a really good skill, persuasion, and then argument, and then knowing how to sort through things. And so I just want to look at a couple of things that a short passage, and it's a very, maybe stereotypical kind of teacher thing, almost like a high school teacher thing, but I like the passage because it has a lot of persuasion packed into just a short paragraph. So let's take a look at this paragraph. And what I'd recommend right now, if you're watching this video, just pause the video and just read this paragraph if you can. It's gets cut off almost at the end there, so hopefully you can see the whole thing. And this is, you can see the first sentence: passengers should refuse to ride in any vehicle driven by someone who has been drinking. So obviously, like I said, sounds like maybe kind of a high school teacher lecturing to you, but I don't want it to, hopefully it doesn't come across like that. I just find that this is a good persuasive paragraph because every sentence, it's very economical. Each sentence is teaching us or using one of the methods that I've been sharing with the class. So take a moment if you can and just pause. And as you're reading, when you pause this, see if you can just find any examples of some of the methods of persuasion that we've talked about, like facts, examples, what's called predicting the consequences, answering the opposition, referring to an authority. Remember, we have those 5. And there's a handout in Blackboard, which I'll include in the folder again this week. So you can click on that too if you want to go back and review those. So again, if you want to pause it, read this, and then I'll go ahead and keep moving, give you a second to pause. All right, so if you did get to pause that, let's look at the first example, predicting the consequences. Remember, this is a method of persuasion in which you tell somebody, usually uses the word if. So there's the word if right there on the screen. And I always give the example when I was a kid and I was getting in trouble, my parents, my mom or my dad would say, if you don't stop doing that right now, you're going to be, and then they would predict some consequences, that something bad that might happen if I didn't change my behavior, right? Or vice versa. If you would just do your homework and just do what you're supposed to, and they might have some good consequences or rewards and so on. So that's a very basic level. And in this essay, they predict the consequences. And they say, first and foremost, you can go back to the passage if you want to see this one, right? It's right up here at the top. First and foremost, first and most important rather, such a refusal could save lives. In other words, they're telling people don't ride with somebody who's been drinking. And the prediction is, if you don't, it could actually save your life. And the implication, of course, the opposite is, if you do, it could risk your life. So that's the first one, and this is predicting the consequences. So again, if you want to pause the video, each one of these, go back and find them. You can do that, but I'll go through each one. We had 5 methods of persuasion. The writer also uses facts to support their opinion. The National Council on Alcoholism reports that drunk driving causes 25,000 deaths and 50% of all traffic accidents a year. Now, this is a good example for a fact, rather, for several reasons. First of all, it's a big number, right? It's a lot of people. 50% of all how many traffic accidents do we have I mean, that's a lot, right? Just in Chicago, that would be a lot of people. So it's a good sized sample. The other thing that's good about it is we could potentially find the source of this information, the National Council on Alcoholism. Now, if we Google that and we find out that doesn't exist, we might get suspicious. So again, when you give a fact, one of the good things to do is don't do what my dad used to do. He would say independent government sources, which didn't exist. It was just, he was just making something up and he wanted to prove something. Don't do that. That's fine in conversation. But when you're writing an academic paper, make sure we can find the source of your. So anytime you're quoting or saying something in an essay, make sure you do like they did here, the National Council on Alcoholism, or I found this in an article in the online journal of whatever, higher education or whatever it might be, right? Or one of the databases at the library, or this was in a book, et cetera, et cetera. But facts are good, but just make sure your audience can figure out where you got your facts. And that's probably one of the things that is kind of a pet peeve for me these days, just in public, not only with student writing or anything, just in public, how sometimes people do state a fact, but then they don't tell you where they found it or back it up with anything. And that creates kind of a weak argument. All right, answering the opposition. This is when we try to imagine what somebody who might disagree with us, what they might say, and we try to answer that before they even, kind of beat them to the punch, so to speak. So the second reason in the paragraph is an answer to the opposition. What point is the writer answering? So if we go back, the second point, I think they say, second, writers might tell themselves that some people drive well after a few drinks, but this is just not true. So you can see there's our answer to the opposition. Writers might tell themselves that's the opposition. The person who might tell themselves that some people drive better drunk, if we're writing this paper, we're answering them. So we're coming up with an answer. It's not true. Now they have to go on a little bit. Just saying something's not true is not a perfect answer to the opposition, but they go on by referring to an authority, and that's another method of persuasion. And they talk about Dr. Burton Belloc. Now, who's Dr. Belloc? Just because he has a doctor in front of his name, what does that make him be a PhD? But he's actually of the local alcohol treatment center, explains that even one drink can lengthen the reflex time and weaken the judgment needed for safe driving. So he works, I think, manages the local alcoholism treatment center. And so he's a good authority on this because he obviously deals with alcoholism and over drinking and all that kind of stuff a lot. And so again, the writer is an authority, and that backs up the previous one where we're answering the opposition. So why should you not do this? Well, people actually don't drive better drunk. And Dr. Burton Belloc says your reflex time, even just after one drink, might lengthen. So in other words, your reflexes are a little slower. So that's referring to an authority and answering the opposition kind of combined, really strong methods of persuasion. Like I said, that's why I chose this paragraph, because it is just full of all the methods of persuasion that we could use. Answering the opposition, one more time. The third reason in the argument is risking your life is foolish. The reason is really another answer to the opposition. What point is the writer answering? So if we go back, we can find this section in the paragraph in purple here. Other writers might feel foolish to ruin a social occasion. So you feel kind of silly having to say, I'm not going to ride with you because you've been drinking, but risking their lives is even more foolish. So this is kind of the opposition. Oh, I'm going to feel foolish. And this is their answer. Finally, by refusing to ride with a driver, one passenger could influence other passengers or the driver. So we get an answer to the opposition. It's dangerous, but then also this other reason. And then finally, there's one example in the paragraph. What example does the writer supply to back up this reason? So they have the reason, you could influence somebody. So that's a great reason to not ride with somebody who's been drinking. And we have this example, just one student, but Marie Ferriot, a student at Central High School, is an example. When three friends who had obviously been drinking offered a ride from school, she refused despite the driver's teasing. Hearing Marie's refusal, two of her friends got out of the car too. So it's sort of just like, that's a small example, but it's still personal. We might even call this an anecdote sometimes, a story of a friend. And that's perfect to use in an essay, as long as that's not the only kind of evidence you're providing, but it can work. So one more example. And again, if you go back to the beginning of this whole paragraph again, we just went through each one. We're seeing one of the types. We're seeing predicting the consequences, facts, answering the opposition, referring to an authority, answering the opposition again, and finally an example. And that is a real quick rundown, kind of a review of methods of persuasion. One of the things I'm going to do in the peer response this time is ask you to see if you can find methods of persuasion in your peer response partner's essay. And I'll say more. We'll see more about that when you actually look at the peer response. And again, I'll post the Methods of persuasion, again, in our folder this week. All right, the last thing I wanted to talk about this week, if you've watched the other two videos, thank you and good job for getting through these. And we're going to talk very quickly just about how to use semicolons and colons. And these punctuation marks are often a little bit problematic, especially the semicolon can be hard to use correctly. Colon's a little easier. If you want more information on this, pages 377 to 381 or section 32A and 32B in the Hard Brace Essentials book, our textbook for the class, you can find a little bit more than I'm going to give you here, but I'll quickly go through a couple of examples. So here's my bad, maybe English teacher dad joke or something. The semicolon here, colon actually says, "Why are you crying?" And the semicolon says, "Nobody understands me." So semicolons are kind of hard to understand sometimes and can be hard to use. And so that's why the bad joke there, just to illustrate the point that these can be difficult. So I want to go through real quickly. The semicolon most frequently connects two independent clauses. And if you remember when we talked about sentence structure, independent clauses are basically complete sentences. So I went to the store, I bought some turkey, whatever, turkey and bread or something. And so each one of those parts is an independent clause because it has a subject, verb, and a complete thought. If we want to connect those because they're related, a semicolon would be one possible way to do that. We also have like comma, fanboy. You might remember me talking about that before, or what's called comma conjunction. But so a semicolon, one of the most frequent things it does is it connects two independent sentences. So let's look at this example about basil. I'm starting to think, oh, things are going to start growing again. We'll have basil and all kinds of other things growing outside. That'll be good. So for many cooks, basil is a key ingredient. Now here, notice a semicolon because this is a complete sentence basically, but it's very related to this one and they're also short. So why not just make one sentence out of it and use a semicolon? It appears in recipes worldwide. And this is when we're kind of connecting ideas, and the second idea is actually supporting the first one. So you want to make sure if you're using a semicolon, they have to be closely related. You don't want to connect two sentences that are not really related, obviously. And the second one's kind of the same thing, but in this case, we're contrasting two things. Sweet basil is used in Mediterranean dishes, semicolon. Thai basil is used in Asian and East Indian recipes, contrast. So we're contrasting. So again, they're related, but they're just one is contrast and one is supporting the first idea. And again, you could do this differently. You could put a period in a capital letter. There's nothing wrong with that, but this is just one way. If you have these related sentences connecting what are called independent clauses, a semicolon is a good way to do that. Another thing that semicolons can be used similar, but you use a transitional expression with it. So here we've used, we have again, an independent clause. Basil is present in the cuisine of some countries, and then we use a transition, for example, but we put the semicolon, the transition, and then a comma. And so this is another way semicolons can be used to connect two related sentences. Very same thing here. Culinary uses of basil are well known, and we have our semicolon, our transitional word, however. Here we used for example, and then a comma. And that's, again, we've connected these two independent clauses. I'm going through this quickly, but again, there is a section in the book if you want to look at it. This is probably the most complicated way to use a semicolon. So if you don't want to try this one, you don't have to, but it is one usage of a semicolon. And it's what we call separating elements or different parts. And what you'll notice is I've color-coded these based on the fact that they're based on what they're describing. So to survive, this is all about survival, right? For mountain lions, they need a large area. So this is about their habitat. They need a steady supply of deer, skunks, raccoons, foxes, possums, and they need the opportunity to find a mate. So this, and establish a den and raise a litter. So each section of this is set off, if you notice, with a semicolon. So this looks like a huge sentence, right? To survive, mountain lions need a large area in which to. Now you could put a period here and just have 3 sentences, but they're all related ideas. So again, and they're all independent clauses, or they're including with the to survive, they would be independent clauses. So all this information can be set up just with a semicolon, and again, it's all related, and it's almost like a paragraph when you do that. So if that's kind of complicated and you don't want to mess with that, you don't have to, but it's just another use that you'll see of semicolons. All right, again, if you can, pause the video and maybe just take a second and see if you can decide where each one of these 2 sentences would have a semicolon if you were going to put one in here. And again, what we've been looking at is we set off usually 2 independent clauses. So a sentence maybe we have um, a transitional word, and the semicolon comes before that usually. So take a moment if you want to, and then I'll show you the answer. Okay, so here's where I would put it. The game is called soccer only in Canada and the United States. Elsewhere, it's known as football. These are very clearly related sentences, so we use a semicolon to connect them. In amateur matches, players can be substituted frequently, however, with a comma here, but the semicolon before the transition. And again, we have these two related sentences that go together, and we use a semicolon with them. All right, that was very fast, and semicolons are kind of complicated, but again, I'm just sharing quickly. Same thing with colons. You can find information about these on 379 to 381. This is like the two, stacked periods, right? One on top of the other. And a colon calls attention to what follows. It also separates titles from subtitles, and it has special uses in business, correspondence, scriptural, meaning like religious, or bibliographic references. Let's look at a couple of examples of how we use colons. If you want to have an explanation to kind of add more explanation to a sentence that you wrote at the beginning, no one expected the game to end as it did. Well, how was that? Well, we put a colon and we add our explanation. After 7 extra innings, the favored team collapsed. Speaking of baseball, I believe this Thursday is the opening day, at least for the Cubs. And what about the White Sox? Is it the same day? Is that the whole MLB's opening day? Not sure, but anyway, not related to colons, but just the baseball sentence. Marcel Proust explained the importance of mindfulness. So this is a quotation. Sometimes you can introduce a quotation with a semicolon if it's a complete sentence, and we did that here. So we have this quotation from Proust, and it comes right after what we said. He explained the importance of mindfulness, and then the quote is going to show us how he explained that. Colons can also be used when you have a list, right, that's going to follow, introducing a list. The website provides statistics for 3 states, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. So these 3 states, and we have our colon, basically, that introduces that list. Okay, that's just one more use of that. And then finally, it's often used in between, for example, a title and a subtitle. The 6th extinction, that's the title, colon, subtitle, and unnatural history. We see that a lot. And a colon follows the salutation of a business letter. If you had to write a formal email or business letter, usually a colon is more formal, so in a way more respectful than just using a comma. So if I say, Dear Dr. Horner, comma, it's a little familiar, but if I say, Dear Dr. Horner, colon, it's more businesslike. Also, if you've ever seen like biblical things like Psalms 3:5, Genesis 1:1, they use a colon there, just so you know. That's a way of separating I believe that's the book from the verse. All right, and then, so let's take one more second here and see if you can put the colon in the correct place. So as before with the semicolon, if you could pause the video and just see if you could figure out where a colon might go based on the rules. And if you wanted to go back to the previous parts, you could rewind too. And I'll give you a second. And if you did go away and come back, I'll show you the answers. So here we have the process consists of 6 stages. So we're introducing this kind of list of things, right? So we put the colon, and then we have all the stages in the process. That's a kind of a list. The second one is an explanation. The post-purchase assessment has one of 2 basic results. So whatever this is, this after purchasing something assessment, 2 results, and here are the results: satisfaction or dissatisfaction. Again, the colon introduces an explanation, which gives you more information. So those are the ways that you can use colons and semicolons, and we reviewed methods of persuasion. So as always, if you have any questions, let me know. And just remember, we're in week 11, so we're getting close to 4 or 5 weeks. We're going to be right at the end of the semester. So if you're trying to finish things up, please let me know how I can help if there's anything you're missing. And otherwise, I will see you either in office hours or see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.